Welcome, folks, to 52 Living Ideas. Today is Comprehensivist Wednesday, and it's my pleasure to have John Roth talking about the 4 Cardinal Virtues. Over to you, John.
Okay, let me figure out how to share the screen here. Is that working?
Yes, John, go ahead.
You can see the screen. Okay,
Yep.
good. So thank you, everybody. This is a continuation of a session that was done toward the end of May. And I mentioned 2 cardinal virtues in a section that I called motivation. And so the idea this time is to put all 4 of the cardinal virtues, temperance, justice, strength, and prudence, all 4 in a single session. And so the first half will cover temperance and fortitude, and the material is basically the same as what was shown in the earlier session. The emphasis is going to be a little bit different because I'm really wanting to suggest more about what are psychological archetypes and how mythological images or historical images can become archetypal manifestations. So that's where we're going. The script is in 2 parts. Each part takes about 20 minutes to recite. So we'll cover the first 2, and then there will be a brief break and some questions, room for questions. And then we'll finish up with the other 2, justice and prudence, which will be new material that I haven't shared like this before. So with that, I think we're ready to go, and I'll begin. The concept of psychological archetypes was brought forward by Carl Jung during the early part of the past century. Archetypes might be understood as latent, persistent memories and patterns that can affect the behavior of an individual person or of a collective group. Over the past several years, I've been privately concerned with themes around the evident extension of depth psychology beyond individual therapy or counseling or social work. It's possible to adapt certain realizations from depth psychology toward better understanding of personal individual experience and collective social experience. Marie-Louise von Franz was one of Jung's closest and most respected associates. She described archetypes of the collective unconscious in this manner in 1972. By archetype, Jung understood, as we know, an inherited psychic behavior pattern that's common to the whole human species. It's not a question here of inherited ideas, but rather of the mentally expressed instincts, that is, of forms, not contents. The archetype is an observable general structure, which only in individual cases, when aroused, manifests in the inner perception of mythical images and ideas, or in the expression of ritual gestures, all of which are accompanied by strong emotion. Archetypes thus represent a psychic field of probability in that they delineate average instinctual unconscious activity in terms of types. The archetype is the introspectively recognizable form of a priori psychic orderedness. 4 most prominent archetypal representations are characterized as the persona, the shadow, the anima or animus, and the self. The nature of each of these is described extensively in the psychological literature. Without going into detail, it may also be seen that there's a common sequence or succession about how they will become evident as an individual person gradually acquires psychological maturity or fullness over the course of many years. The recognition of archetypal patterns can be correlated with reference to defined psychological attitudes of extroversion or introversion, as well as the psychological functions of sensation, thinking, feeling, and intuition. But there will be a nuanced consideration around how these will be evident in any given instance. The purpose of this excursion is to consider the relatedness of the four traditional cardinal virtues as inherent impulses or intentions, which can potentially become present to encourage advancement toward psychological maturity or fullness. Several assumptions will be guiding the exercise. Evident qualities displayed by historical classical Greek deities, as well as recurring relationships among them, can be readily associated with distinctive attributes of virtue. Each of the cardinal virtues can be seen to carry a special affinity with a particular gathering or circle of relatedness with respect to the psychological attitudes and functions which are defined in terms of typologies. In view of every instance, one of the related attitude and function combinations appears to be predominant in consideration of the selected virtue. These kinds of associations and qualifications were explored in some manner by humanist scholars during the Italian Renaissance. So those sources are essential today as a basis of understanding that is still useful, even during our present times. Temperance. An especially acclaimed artist was working in Italy during the early Renaissance in the city of Florence, Sandro Botticelli. An iconographic interpretation has come from an esteemed art connoisseur and historian, Edgar Wind, who was a scholar associated with the Warburg Institute and a professor at Oxford University. La Primavera is seen as a study in benevolence and graciousness. The interpretation stresses a central allegory equivalent to the civil virtue of temperance. Here, temperance is understood to represent goodwill, harmony, and contentment. The humanistic inferences from the age of the Renaissance would differ considerably from what is thought about temperance in the current contemporary popular social imagination, implying a stern resistance to excessiveness of any kind. Fundamental historical idealizations are more subtle and enduring compared with immediate superficial impressions. The temperance construct may be seen as a dynamic balance comprised of four separate aspects, an essence described through relatedness among figures from classical Greek mythology, Eros, Hephaestus, Aphrodite, and Hermes. Aphrodite became married to Hephaestus, although Hermes is never far away, and Eros happens to be the son of Aphrodite and Hermes. An analysis by renowned mythological scholar Karl Karenyi comes close to defining an underlying common sensibility. Eros is a divinity very closely related to Hermes. His nature, explicit in his name, Eros, demanding love, is more uniform in tone than that of Hermes. Nevertheless, the same ground tone is unmistakable in Hermes too. The universe knows a melody, so we could describe the somewhat complex phenomena whose theme is the eternal relationship of love, thievery, and affairs. In the masculine key, this melody is Hermes. In the feminine key, the same melody, and not yet the same, since man and woman are different, is Aphrodite. Hephaestus is known as a practical worker and a skilled master craftsman who limped on both feet since the soles and heels were turned back to front and were not fitted for walking, but only for a forward motion of the whole body. He's sometimes presented as a crippled dwarf. Also, according to the classical scholar Karl Karenyi, he created young virgins made of gold who moved as if they were alive and thought and talked as women. He created the first woman, who is Pandora. If the marriage of Hephaestus and Aphrodite seems strange and contradictory by normal mortal standards, the unusual relatedness extends further, since Hermes and Aphrodite were also sometimes considered to be twins, both born on the same day of the same month. There's that primary reflection between Aphrodite and Hermes, since they can be understood as feminine and masculine representations, suggesting something of the same nature. A dynamic thematic range also resides between Hephaestus and Eros, spreading from intensity to necessity. Temperance encloses or frames these apparently distant impulses. In his wondrous book, The Marriage of Cadmus and Harmony, Roberto Colasso emphasizes the essential operative theme. In the late pagan era, love is represented with a kiss, necessity with a knot. Two circular images, the mouth and the noose, embrace everything that is. There's a hostility that springs from an obscure likeness as between the knot and the kiss. Anarchy is necessity, and Colosso describes the attitude of the ancient Greeks, declaring of the two, they prefer to submit to Eros rather than to anarchy, even though they know Eros is just a dazzling cover for anarchy, and cover in the literal sense. Anarchy's inflexible bond, which tightens in a great circle around the world, is covered by a speckled belt, which we see in the sky as the Milky Way. He continues to explain, but we can also see it in miniature, on the body of Aphrodite, when the goddess wears her many-hued embroidered girdle, in which all charms and spells reside. Tenderness and desire are there, and softly spoken words. The seduction that has stolen the intellect, even from those of sound mind. Hephaestus is a son of Hera, but she casts him out from Olympus immediately after he was born, because he appears to be so deformed and ugly. Raised in the wild, he discovers his skill to make beautiful and useful implements. Hephaestus gets revenge on his mother Hera when he creates a magnificent throne to trap her and hold her as a captive. The greatest of the gods, Zeus, agrees to pledge the marriage of Aphrodite to Hephaestus as the ransom for releasing his own wife Hera from the bonds of the clever device. All themes regarding desires, bonds, bounds, and limitations govern the idea comprising what is temperance. In La Primavera, then, the figure of the mythological goddess at the center evokes extroverted feeling. The assertive male character toward the right invokes introverted thinking. The Cupid up above evokes extroverted sensation. The contemplative mythological god to the left evokes introverted intuition. Here, the point of emphasis is meant to stress how the motivational theme of personal fulfillment is actually closely related to the classical understandings about the essential nature of temperance as a cardinal virtue. A moment of reflection reminds that courage or strength may be counteracted through humanistic awareness of temperance to realize truly long-standing resilience and endurance. Courage. Also during the height of the Renaissance, an allegory of courage was devised by the Venetian master artist Giorgione about 500 years ago. Again, a special interpretation has come from Edgar Wind. The painting, known as The Tempest, explicitly depicts a theme of fortitude, and fortitude, of course, is often used as a synonym of courage. Within the scenario of the painting, The Tempest, the town in the distant background presupposes institutional or social conventionality, introverted feeling, enforced also with a standing male, costumed like a mercenary soldier of that time. The bridge in the very middle of the composition acts as a means of connection and association, extroverted thinking. The moon, the lightning, and the threatening storm suggest an impending immediacy deserving attention, extroverted intuition. The calm posturing of the female figure nursing an infant implies a focused presence in the moment, introverted sensation. And an additional hidden figure mysteriously appears, visible only under X-ray examination. The construct of courage is exemplified in the figures of Persephone, Demeter, Artemis, and Ares. Here it's especially necessary to keep in mind that divine deities are not constrained by normal mortal human limitations. Idealized embodiments extend to pose ever-varying manifestations. The mythological ancestors and predecessors of the Olympian gods are the father Kronos and the mother Rhea. Zeus struggles to defeat Kronos with the assistance of the mother. Overcoming Kronos, Zeus assumes his power and position. Rhea transforms to become Demeter, while Persephone, the daughter, proceeds from Zeus, born by Demeter. Persephone and Demeter may actually have meager individual identities, except through their intimate interconnection. But with respect to each other, the fullness of their reach is vast and richly suggestive. Just as Demeter bears a shadowed association with Zeus, Persephone holds a dark association with Hades, the Greek god of the dead and the afterlife. Persephone is captured by Hades and she becomes his wife during the barren part of the year, returning to spend the abundant and fruitful part of the year with her mother Demeter. Karl Karenli defines the shared commonality between Persephone and Demeter exactly in the character of another goddess. Artemis, for instance, is to be found in the untamedness of young animals and equally in the terror of birth. In the classical figures of the goddess, the wilderness and the terrors meet at the borderline. They are in equilibrium. The further we penetrate into her prehistory, the more the outlines connected with the name Artemis evaporate. The borderline situation widens into a border region, midway between motherhood and maidenhood, the joy of life and the lust for murder, fecundity, and animality. Karenni observes how the triad of Demeter, Persephone, and Kore is so closely associated with the older, darker figure known as Akkadi that all of the names are used interchangeably to some degree. Demeter personifies the cycles of nature and the 4 seasons of the year. Fortune and plenty belong in her domain. Persephone expresses the intrinsic forces of life. Artemis reflects the waxing and waning phases of the moon. Inception, growth, fullness, decline, decay, death, regeneration, and renewal are all included inside the full realm of natural progression. The 3 goddesses stand behind the dynamic of organic existence. The human exercise of courage or fortitude is somehow always bound up together with an awareness of the order of physical life. As an intrusive or disruptive entity, Aries challenges and defies the gathered natural rhythms. His name sounded like Ara, curse, although indeed his word also means prayer and was almost another name for war. Throughout every discussion of morality, specifics of immediate circumstance and identity always deserve examination. One modern philosopher, Philippa Foot, draws attention to a distinction between what may be considered to be courage and rudeness. An action to spit at someone in a public place might normally appear to be motivated by rudeness. But if the apparent victim in such a situation happens to be a political tyrant, who's obviously responsible for killing many weak and innocent people, then the immediate act is a reflection of courage. The difference between what is life-supporting and what is life-denying plays within the definition between the grouping of the natural goddesses Persephone, Demeter, and Artemis as representatives of courage, and the god of war, Ares, who may ultimately even become a representative of what may be seen as exaggerated or protected cowardness. Some sense of ultimate purpose may be assisted through the works of Joseph Pieper, who'd become accomplished as a young scholar in Germany during the early part of the 20th century, before his works were condemned and confiscated by the Nazi regime. Stationed with the military during World War II, he returned to writing and teaching as a professor at a German university after the defeat of the Third Reich and the restoration of peace. His reflections about the 4 cardinal virtues appeared in English over 50 years ago, and his life experience would enforce a depth of commitment and conviction. These concerns would precede and preconfigure the more current trends in virtue ethics and positive psychology. The book, The 4 Cardinal Virtues, is apparently now in the public domain, and the full text is freely and openly available through archival internet sources. Temperance, according to Joseph Pieper. It's a commonplace, though nonetheless mysterious truth, that man's inner order, unlike that of the crystal, the flower, or the animal, is not a simply given and self-evident reality, but rather that the same forces from which human existence derives its being can upset that inner order to the point of destroying the spiritual and moral person. It's always the decisive center of the whole individual person by which the inner order is upheld or upset. Fortitude, according to Joseph Pieper. Fortitude presupposes vulnerability. Without vulnerability, there's no possibility of fortitude. To be brave actually means to be able to suffer injury. Because man is by nature vulnerable, he can be brave. Pericles, in the lofty words of his speech for the fallen heroes, expressed, "For this too is our way, to dare most liberally where we have reflected best. With others, only ignorance begets fortitude, and reflection but begets hesitation." Pericles, cited by Thucydides, Peloponnesian War, Book 2. To be brave is not the same as to have no fear. Indeed, fortitude actually rules out a certain kind of fearlessness, namely the sort of fearlessness that's based on a false appraisal and evaluation of reality. So that concludes my comments on temperance and fortitude. So I'll take a break here and we'll continue, I believe, with some questions.
Yes. So let me tell everybody about the format. John, could you stop sharing the screen for a moment? All right, folks. So now what we're going to do is, so let me talk about the format. So John's presentation is divided into two parts. So first it's the first two virtues, and then we're going to do a Q&A. You can ask any question about the four cardinal virtues or, temperance and courage. Then it'll be this other two virtues, and then there will be a more lengthy Q&A following that. After which we are going to do breakout rooms, after which we will do takeaways, and then we will go back, take in all the observations from everybody with their takeaways, and then go back to one more round of breakout rooms. So that's the format. So now you are welcome to ask questions. In order to ask questions, go ahead. We've got 4 rules of civility. You type an exclamation mark or raise your hand in Zoom in order to speak. Number 2, keep on topic. Number 3, be brief. And number 4, be courteous. Feel free to disagree with anything, but do so courteously. So first up is Joe. Joe, go ahead.
Hi, John. Thank you for presenting this evening. One of the things that you'd mentioned was the idea of intensity and necessity and temperance. So is temperance the chief virtue that makes us human? Or is it something like wisdom where you have to be cognizant of being temperate and where you're, so let me just stop with that. Is essentially temperance is chief among like the virtues as far as being human?
Sure, and we'll continue to cover that in the second half. Wisdom is most closely associated with prudence, and so essentially bear with me, and that point will be addressed. I want to say that the way this talk has been structured is meant to stress the archetypal nature of the virtues, and the fact that as archetypes, they're subtle influences that are available and present. And the reason that I'm going into this much detail and suggesting some of the qualifications and qualities here is that I would suggest for others who might not be very familiar with this, that even if you don't get it at first pass, that if you just sort of remember it and keep it in mind, you'll begin to find that these things do appear. And so the point of temperance, and again, this will be mentioned in the conclusion with Joseph Piper, but the point of temperance is really, it resides with the well-being of the individual person, and focuses on each person for themselves, and the other virtues have very different characters.
Thank you, John. Next up is Marjorie. Marjorie, go ahead. Marjorie, you need to unmute yourself.
I was going to say, this is a bit selfish, but I'm working on something on common sense. So when you said something about the balance between some of these things led to an underlying common sense ability, I found that a really interesting collection of phrases, and wonder if you could explain, firstly, what common sense is, why you use the word underlying, and really whether it is an ability, but I'm most concerned with your definition of common sense.
Okay, yeah, what I meant with that phrasing about common sensibility, again, was the archetypal quality of these things. And what I'm meaning to suggest, following the Jung and Marie-Louise von Franz and the psychological theorists, is that perhaps I should have said just collective unconscious outright. But the interesting point here is that they're meant to be universal. And where I think it gets kind of fascinating here is that I'm really emphasizing what people will find if they have a background in Western culture or Western civilization, or European culture and European civilization. And what I think gets to be quite fascinating here is that if you start talking about, well, what about somebody who grew up in India or China or Japan or elsewhere, Africa? Are these same manifestations coming forward in some form? So this is a little bit different than I think what's conventionally understood by common sense.
All right. So let me ask just
Wait,
one.
can I just say I didn't understand from that what you think common sense is?
No, Marjorie, it was not common sense. It is common sensibility.
Oh, no, he said common sense. Okay. Oh, common sense. Oh, sensibility. Yes.
Yeah,
So
it is the concept of archetypes. So let me ask about that. So John, I mean, the interesting thing is, I mean, the thing I like about this presentation is the juxtaposition of the ethical ideas and the visuals and the mythological stories. Can you talk a little bit about the role visual arts and stories have played in communicating archetypes?
Well, this was one of the reasons why I like using these representations from the Renaissance, is because most of these images are somehow familiar. The Botticelli images, I imagine almost everyone has seen those before somehow. And the point of this is that there was a point in time when the Renaissance, and I think that the Renaissance really acted as a kind of a plateau where a whole set of moral and ethical imperatives got reconsidered and repackaged, if you will. So so there were scholars who were working on this, there were artists who were working on it. It was the cutting edge technology and effort of the time. And it was so powerful that I think that it's still present in the background in an awful lot of what we do, even though it's in the background and we don't quite appreciate it unless it's something happens to make it come forward. And the other thing that I'd say is that even though if you look for this particular strain, that it keeps repeating itself. And there are, as you know, there are phases, there are trends, there are fashions in artistic expression, and these keep coming back. So I am going to be referencing some 20th century pieces. And the last piece that I had put up is a piece by Henry Matisse that was one of the last works that he did before he died. And I think that if you just set aside the images, but you look at the geometries, the repetition of the fourness and the clusters, the qualifications, the symmetries, that I think that's another level of this, where you let go of the images, but even the forms are there as something that suggests how to be more complete in what you are trying to do.
Thank you, John. So shall we continue with the second part of the presentation, and then we'll do a more extensive Q&A at that point. Go ahead.
Okay, share screen. Are we good? You can see the slide?
Yes.
Okay. Marie-Louise von Franz would offer careful clarification concerning the nature of psychological archetypes from an essay on matter and psyche composed in 1974. In other words, archetypes are in themselves completely unobservable structures. Only when they're stimulated by some inner or outer state of need, either inner compensation processes or outer stimuli, do they, at crucial moments, produce an archetypal image, an archetypal fantasy, a thought, an intuition, or an emotion. These can be recognized as archetypal because they are similar in all cultures and among all peoples. At this point, that may seem a bit abstractly formulated, but if we read a collection of love songs or war songs from all over the world, we will see that people in such archetypal situations ever and again express similar feelings, ideas, and fantasies. There is no doubt that the archetypal structures are inherited. This is not, however, the case with images. Jung was repeatedly reproached with the idea that mental images could not be hereditary. But he never claimed that. The disposition is passed down, the structures are passed on, and then they always produce the same or similar images afresh. When an inborn archetypal structure passes into the manifest form of an archetypal fantasy or image, the psyche makes use of impressions from the external surroundings for its means of expression. Therefore, the individual images are not entirely identical, but only similar in structure. Justice. The virtue of justice would concern responsible personal and social conduct, especially encompassing aspects of obsession, contention, focused attention, and rightful resolution. In keeping with the treatment of recalling representations from the time of the Italian Renaissance, the enduring nature of heroic legend deserves consideration. The ancient adventures of St. George and the depictions by the Renaissance artist Raphael Sanzio may be suggestive in this regard. It may be imagined that some telling of the story will be familiar for almost everyone. There's one historical version worth mentioning, written by a prominent authority of the Middle Ages. The Golden Legend by Jacobus de Barrigan, which dates from the 13th century, will seem obscure today, but it's at least worth knowing because it gathers together many evocative impressions that are indispensable for anyone wandering through the medieval section of any major museum with an especially active curiosity. The story of St. George, here abridged for simplicity. St. George was a knight and born in Cappadocia. One time he came to the city of Cyllene in the province of Libya. Near the city was a pond wherein there was a dragon, which was poisoning all the country. Whenever he, the dragon, approached the city, he poisoned the people with his breath. And therefore the people of the city gave to him every day 2 sheep to eat, so that he would do no harm to the people. When they ran out of sheep, he was given a man and a sheep. Then an ordinance was made that the children and the young people of the town should be chosen by lottery to feed the dragon. Whoever the lot fell upon, wealthy or poor, he or she was delivered to the dragon. One time the lot fell upon the king's daughter, and the sorrowful king said to his people, "For the love of the gods, take gold and silver and all that I have, but let me have my daughter." They said, "Sir, you've made the law, and our children are now dead, but you would do to the contrary. Your daughter shall be given, or else we shall burn you in your house." Then the king had his daughter dressed like a bride, embraced and kissed her, gave her his blessing, and led her to the place where the dragon was. When she was there, St. George passed by, and seeing the lady, he asked her what she was doing there. While they were thus talking together, the dragon appeared and came running toward them. St. George, who was on his horse, drew his sword, made the sign of the cross, then rode swiftly toward the dragon. He struck him with his spear, injuring him severely. Then he said to the maid, "Tie your belt around the dragon's neck and be not afraid." When she had done so, the dragon followed her meekly. She led him into the city, and the people fled in fear. St. George said to them, "Doubt not, believe in God and Jesus Christ, and be baptized, and I shall slay the dragon." There's more to the story, but this excerpt should be enough for now. Presumably, St. George had lived and died as an early Christian martyr during the 3rd century, and the legend has persisted for a very long time. The vigorous pursuit of comparisons and correlations involving early classical understandings and Christian ideas became an energetic enterprise by the time of the Renaissance. Now, during the recent past century, the artist Pablo Picasso would often deploy many of the same themes, especially in response to the Spanish Civil War and the fascist atrocities of Europe. It's hoped that an authentic moral integrity will endure and will outlast institutionalized instances of violence and oppression. In accordance with ancient associations, the justice construct would be comprised of certain attributes of the gods Poseidon, Dionysus, Apollo, along with the goddess Athena. The pair of Poseidon and Athena can be seen to be connected in myth, as is the pair of Dionysus and Apollo. When the Greek region of Attica was first inhabited, Poseidon and Athena vied for recognition. Poseidon struck with his trident the rock on which the Acropolis was to stand, and thus actually causing a spring to rise. It was also told on this occasion he caused the first horse to spring from the earth. Athena planted the olive, and for this the chieftain judged her the victor. Athena offered the first olive tree, and therefore she was chosen to be the original patroness of the city of Athens. Then too, coincidentally, the opposing figures of Dionysus and Apollo might separately preside at the same ancient Greek temple, but not necessarily at the same time. So Roberto Calasso observes, in the freezing winter months, the months when the dead rise and torches wander about the slopes of Parnassus, Dionysus is the lord of Delphi. But then Apollo returns, and for the other 9 months of the year, he reigns supreme. No victory is ever complete, nor enough to last the whole year. More significantly, 2 sovereign lines descend from Zeus, that of Dionysus and that of Apollo. Dionysus' line is more obscure than Apollo's. Only rarely does it emerge from the shadow. Since he's both snake and bull, all history before Zeus is recalled in him and begins again with him. A series of stories involving the hero Theseus may convey something of the appropriate complex associations between Apollo and Dionysus and Athena and Poseidon. According to some of the early legends, Theseus is recognized as the founder of Athens, consolidating a confederation of villages as a city-state. Previously, the district had been invaded by the forces of King Minos, the monarch and tyrant from the island of Crete. A contingent of young men and women were regularly sent in tribute to be devoured by the monstrous Minotaur, held inside an elaborate labyrinth. With help from a daughter of Minos, Theseus defeats the Minotaur and frees Athens from the domination of Crete. Theseus united the scattered Attic communities and transformed Athens from a Mycenaean citadel into a city-state. He was also a sailor. As a youth, he sailed to Crete, where he slew the Minotaur and found his way out of the labyrinth. A long sea voyage brought him back to Athens, where, according to Plutarch, his ship was preserved as a sacred relic. The sea, the realm of Poseidon, graciously supports the mission of Theseus. The respective authority of each of the 4 divine entities is honored in the personality of Theseus. He journeys across Poseidon's underwater world. He defended the city-state dedicated to Athena. He conquers a monstrous adversary, echoing the excessiveness of Dionysus, and he manages achievements as a heroic figure in keeping with the spirit of Apollo, although Theseus too will not be without his fatal flaws. There are many instances in which Athena and Apollo will be directly associated with one another. These images are from the School of Athens, of Raphael at the Vatican in Rome. As for Athena, her special power of persuasion enables her to restore cooperation among the disparate forces of man and the political state. The Eumenides of Aeschylus represents one primal source, where Athena conceives the jury as a means for attaining justice beyond primitive revenge. Persuasion guided my mouth, Athena explains, in mediating the argument with Furies and saving the life of Orestes. She is above all others, the goddess of civilization. If the authority of Poseidon resides in raw motion, Dionysus conveys a dark, unlimited enragement, and Apollo carries enlightenment. Then Athena comprises something of all of these disparate forces, encompassing and revitalizing each in proper measure. Athena invented the bridle to harness horses. Athena maintains wilder passions in reserve, like the powerful aegis of Zeus which she wears upon her chest. Athena stands alongside Apollo in exerting the authority of Olympus. All these symbolical gestures address the aspiration of justice. In terms of psychology, Athena may convey the brighter aspects of extroverted thinking in aggregating and enforcing fair and reasoned qualification. Poseidon conveys raw extroverted sensation. Apollo embodies the brighter qualities of extroverted intuition. And Dionysus may carry certain difficult, demanding, and even monstrous characteristics with respect to extroverted feeling, at least in consideration of that plateau of understanding from the time of the Renaissance, which has been the theme of these excursions. Of course, it's previously been mentioned that the goddess Aphrodite would also be exemplary of extroverted feeling. So it's necessary to appreciate that each psychological stance may actually reflect a range of connotations, and a certain deliberation is imperative in approaching the meaning of any such determinations. These sorts of divergencies will be present across the full spectrum of attributions. Qualities that may be forward in some circumstances may be regressive under other conditions. So nothing is quite as simple as imagining and assigning singular names or labels. Subtle nuances and qualifications deserve correct consideration and attention in this regard. Prudence. The virtue of prudence will honor the best possible holistic conscientiousness. Prudence is perhaps the most misaligned and misunderstood virtue. As one prominent modern philosopher of virtue and ethics, Alistair McIntyre, has recognized, for later generations of Puritans have connected prudence with thrift, as especially thrift in money matters. So in modern English, prudence has something of the flavor of caution and calculating in one's own interest. In its original sense, the word carries no particular connection with either caution or self-interest. It is the virtue of practical intelligence, of knowing how to apply principles in particular situations. It's not the ability to formulate principles intellectually or to deduce what ought to be done. It's the ability to act so that principles will take concrete form. Prudence is not only a virtue, it is the keystone of all virtues. The prudence construct is comprised of the dynamic of principles suggested by the Greek gods Zeus and Hades, and by the goddesses Hestia and Hera. All four deities are particularly distinguished and powerful as those of the original order of Olympus, the direct descendants of the older order of Father Cronus and Mother Rhea. According to Roberto Colasso, Zeus is everything. He gives pride of place to nothing. Zeus has no character. He's the support beneath every character. Just as his statue in Olympia was the support for all of the shades and parasites on it, his palace admits of every other place. And his voice, the rustling of the low oak, is the closest thing imaginable to undifferentiated sound. A central distinction may reside with what Colasso considers as the imposition and interconnection of ritual hieroskamos, divine marriage and divine sacrifice. Zeus empowers life and Hades conveys an afterlife. Karl Karenier defines Hestia as one who had asked of Zeus the dignity of remaining a virgin and of receiving the first victim of every sacrifice, and Zeus granted her this. She obtained as her sacred place the central point of the house, the hearth, which is also the meaning of her name. Moreover, she received not only the first, but also the last sacrifice at every ceremonial assembly of mortals. Hera becomes the ephemeral Great Mother, one who is always forgotten and revived. For Colasso, the flavor of marriage lingers on in the sacrifice, just as the flavor of sacrifice lingers on in marriage. Memory and imagination linger above and beyond ordinary awareness, yet these may continually work to shape and define ordinary awareness. Zeus immortalizes existence, Hades exacts dissolution, Hestia exemplifies devotion, Hera embodies divine knowing. The associate attributes, the psychological typologies, would represent aspects of introverted sensation, introverted thinking, introverted feeling, and introverted intuition. If it may seem unexpected that primary powers would reflect an introverted attitude, please recall that the attempt here is to convey something of the idealized worldview of the Renaissance. The efforts of Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola would have had the support and patronage of the wealthy de' Medici family. It was believed the contemplative must, in such a practice, govern the active. The gods and goddesses of ancient Greece express emotional demands, which came to consciousness slowly and painfully over a period of many centuries. The tendency to depict such large and intangible concepts in an idealized human embodiment was supplanted when distinctions of pure good versus pure evil became more preeminent. Well, four cardinal virtues would be honored well before the Christian era. Those principles were restated and reinvigorated throughout the medieval period and even up to the present day. Possibly a fundamental organic vitality is misplaced if the convictions which first engendered belief become overlooked or forgotten. A concluding summation may be assisted through the work of Joseph Piper. Justice, according to Joseph Piper. To be just means to recognize the other as other. It means to give acknowledgement even where one cannot love. Justice says there's another person who is other than I, who nevertheless has his own peculiar due. A just man is just, therefore, because he sanctions another person in his very separateness and helps him to receive his due. Wherever justice in the full sense is done, the eternal act is an expression of an inner assent. The other is acknowledged and confirmed in what is due to him. But what is due to him cannot be decided from the objective inner disposition of the one bound by the obligation. What is due to a person, what is an obligation, can and must be ascertained objectively. Prudence, according to Joseph Piper. Truest to being of memory, open-mindedness, clear-sighted objectivity in unexpected circumstances. These are qualities of mind of the prudent man. The meaning of virtue, of prudence, however, is primarily this, that not only the end of human action, but also the means for its realization shall be in keeping with the truth of real things. This in turn necessitates that the egocentric interests of man be silenced in order that he may perceive the truth of real things, so that reality itself may guide him to the proper means for realizing his goal. An additional imperative may be recognized in keeping with the traditional progression or succession of the cardinal virtues. Again, following Joseph Piper. Prudence gives their inner form to all the other cardinal virtues, justice, fortitude, and temperance. But these three are not equally dependent upon prudence. Fortitude is less directly informed by prudence than justice. Justice is the first word of prudence, fortitude the second. Prudence informs fortitude, as it were, through justice. Justice is based solely upon the recognition of reality achieved by prudence. Fortitude, however, is based upon prudence and justice together. Prudence looks to all extant reality, justice to the fellow man. The man of fortitude relinquishes in self-forgetfulness his own possessions in his life. Temperance, on the other hand, aims at each man himself. Temperance implies that man should look to himself and his condition, that his vision and his will should be focused upon himself. All of these qualities and qualifications have long been known to be mutually interassociated, interconnected, and interdependent. A renewed understanding may help revitalize an essential common sensibility about moral principle and practice. Common sensibility again, thank you. That concludes the four cardinal virtues, so I'll close my screen and we're back to you, Shrikant.
Thank you very much, John. Now, folks, this is now time for questions. You can, now there are no restrictions. You can go ahead and ask any questions on this general topic of four cardinal virtues. In order to ask questions, go ahead and type a exclamation mark in chat and I will call upon you to ask questions. So I'm going to start with my question. So one of the things, like when I studied virtue in the great books, the Syntopicon, one of the major issues, one of the major questions that was debated was, is virtue one or is it many? And if it is many, what is the relationship between the many and the one? So for example, Aristotle talks about virtues flowing into one another. So how do you see these four virtues? You know, what is the relationship between them and how do they come together? What's your thought about that?
Well, I think if I've never studied Adler's great ideas in any length, but in glancing through them, I believe that he does include all four of the cardinal
Yes.
virtues in as important ideas, and the point of this is that the virtues have always been considered to be made up of component virtues. So they're kind of like primary virtues and secondary virtues and third order virtues. And it really gets to be a lot of fun because the virtues, if you care for this kind of thing, because the virtues, of course, originally go way back to the Greeks and they appear in the Bible in certain places, although some people question whether they belong there or not. And then by the time you got to the Middle Ages, the virtues were back, and they were a big deal in the Middle Ages. And a couple of interesting points about this was that the virtues were always doing battle against the vices, and there would always be a lead virtue, and most often a lead virtue would be one of the cardinal virtues or something equivalent to that. But also in the medieval tradition, the virtues were always women. They were never male. They were always women. And so that's another aspect of the tradition that I think is very interesting. Because in the Middle Ages, of course, the formal organizations were very paternalistic. And where are the women in this? So that gets to be an interesting topic in itself. So that's a long answer that goes beyond what you really asked, but a little bit more background that I think leads to interesting places.
Thank you. Thank you. Next up is Sanjay. Sanjay, go ahead.
Yes, excellent discussion, John. My question also is around the virtues as exemplified in society. So we have many forms of virtues exemplified. For example, the form of ethics and also how we ascribe goals in society. We see many different approaches throughout different human societies. For example, we have a goal of individualism, and then there's also the goal of collectivism. And these are the central differentiation between the West and the East. It's a simplified version. So how do such divergent approaches, how are they explained through archetypes? If all of humanity share the same archetypes, why do we have, for example, these two divergent approaches?
I think that the archetypes are subtle influences, which are often very present and appear in some manner under stressful conditions or excitement. And of course, my background, my culture, my study, my learning is mostly in Western culture and Western history and Western ideas. So it's interesting to me when I read that these ideas are used elsewhere in other cultures. And I think that in itself is a fascinating topic. Ethics tends to be considered a little bit different from morality. And of course, morality gets bogged down in all kinds of things about behavior as opposed to attitude. For myself, I like to keep morality on a kind of a high ground where it's aspirational and it's idealized and it's personal. Whereas ethics, I think, always gets into the realm of social behaviors and how what you do and how what others do impacts society and impacts other people. Now, that being said, there are a lot of fascinating quarters if one goes there. The most commonly recognized root of the four cardinal virtues is Greek psychology, Greek philosophy, of course. But then during the early Middle Ages, it was picked up. The Middle Ages, it was picked up in the Islamic countries. And one of the fascinating things that I came across at one point was, within the past 10 years, explanations that in the Sufi tradition of morality and behaviors, the four cardinal virtues are honored and of primary importance. And it's even felt that physical disease is cured by a proper understanding of the four cardinal virtues. This is the Sushi Nashkabani tradition. And so you're right, they appear in many different ways in many different places, but in one form or another, they certainly are persistent and seem to go everywhere.
Thank you. Next
So
up,
just
go ahead, Sanjay.
So yeah, I think maybe part of my question didn't come through clearly. So I was focusing. I mean, I agree with what you said about the archetypes being pervasive throughout humanity, and they emerge in very subtle ways. I see that. The question I wanted to focus on was these two aspects of one aspect of individualism versus the other aspect of collectivism, and we see the differences in the portrayals of these in societies, especially Western and Eastern societies. So that's what I wanted to really think about. So individualism and collectivism and how they emerge in different areas of humanity.
Well, I think that individualism, yeah, I mean, this is a whole big discussion in itself. And of course, we believe that the Western culture, the United States, Western culture, has gone off in the direction that we are isolated individuals and we're self-reliant and supposed to take care of yourself and not depend on other people or demand too much from other people. And yes, it's understood that in Eastern cultures that's what I think this where I think this splits out is if you look at the whole tradition of Western culture. And again, you know, it's a huge topic, and we're talking about 2,000 or 3,000 or more years of civilization. And there are certainly good sources to consider these things. But you find that at one certain point in time, one civilization, Western civilization, tends to be predominant. Rome is a big deal for a while, and there are certain values in Rome that were very important at the time, but that were dismissed and sublimated later. And the values of the Middle Ages were very different from the values of the Roman era. But the point of this in Western civilization is it changes in time and place. But inside a society, a country, whatever, a nationality, everyone is pretty much more or less supposed to go on board with what the moving thing is. And to the extent that I've studied Eastern religions, I found that the Eastern religions are less exclusive and more generous, in that the Eastern practices tend to encourage everything at once, be accepting of everything and finding a place for everything. Whereas I don't think that's generally been the way the West has considered these things.
Thank you. Next up is Laura. Laura, do you have a brief question?
No, I rescind it.
Okay. Okay.
Believe it or not.
Okay. Next up is Jeff. Jeff, go ahead.
So, John, thank you for a really enlightening presentation here. Definitely stretched my mind. I spend a great deal of time focused on the issues of the day with people, especially around the United States. And I'm wondering if you were to pick any combination of these virtues or any of them in particular and apply them to, any one of the major issues of the day, pick one that you think is maybe most consequential or most intriguing, from climate change to coping with the pandemic, to rebuilding an economy, to addressing racial injustice. If you could give me an example of how you would apply some of the things that you've presented this evening, that would be useful and it'd be interesting.
What I want to suggest here, this can be done, and for example, in the course of my presentation on justice, I flashed that image that was from the current news of there were the riots or the civil disturbance in Portland, Oregon, and there was the woman who the press identified as Naked Athena, who walked out one night in front of the federal agents, the armed federal soldiers, and took off all her clothes, walked into the middle of the street, sat down on the sidewalk, and spread her legs. And she did this to make a point. And it caught the news, obviously, and it caught people's attention. And so to me, I think that's a very pointed example of a psychological, archetypal expression that someone is choosing to enact in an outright manner. And even though I don't want to carry on too much with these at this point, what I'm interested in is the notion that these are how these behave as archetypes and how they behave as manifestations of the unconscious. And the point to keep in mind, I think, is that they always have a compensating nature, the same way that psychology will talk about dream analysis, that if an image occurs in your dreams and it's persistent, but you don't know why it's there and you don't pay attention to it, and then it tends to spill around and get into your everyday life and in different places. But and then it, until a crisis happens or whatever, and then it demands attention, and it demands that you readjust your life in such a way as to accommodate that. And so again, this is a huge topic, and a tremendous amount has been written in the psychological literature, on the one hand, to talk about what are individual archetypes, and then what happens when they're actually shared collective archetypes, and that whole discussion of collective psychosis or collective neurosis or whatever. And I think that's certainly an important point, and one has to make a decision where, when these things begin to manifest themselves, is what are you going to do about it? Do you have to do something, or do you just have to get out of the way? So I'm suggesting that the archetypes are present, and if one looks for them, you'll find them in places like that Naked Athena demonstration. And then the question is does this make a difference? Does it broadcast? Does it say something? Does it convince people? There are other instances where it can be suggested that it very much does make a difference.
Next up is going to be Bethany, followed by Joseph. Bethany, go ahead.
Well, I think you actually covered one of the points that I was going to ask about. So I appreciate that. And I appreciate every place you took my mind to. So actually just some comments. You had me thinking of Marcus Aurelius with the quote of whatever you're about to find fault with somebody else, ask yourself the following question: what fault is mine that nearly resembles that. And then I had myself thinking about Cornel West and his quote on justice is what love looks like in public, and kind of the overlap of all the virtues and how they continue to pop up all over the place if you pay attention to just to your point. I just wanted to make those comments that you covered what my question was.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And
very
also to add a little bit there, if I may, that of course Marcus Aurelius wrote directly about the four cardinal virtues in his meditations, and advocated them and claimed that this was something that guided his life and his belief. And also Marcus Aurelius is considered to be a primal example of Stoicism. So I know that other evenings you have conversations about Stoicism, and so there's an overlap here about what we mean by these principles, and if one chooses to honor them and make them preeminent, is that a function of Stoicism? And also to be said, there's that other expression, and I'm going to get this wrong, but there's that line that Barack Obama used to use about justice, because somebody can think of it, I'm sure that I'm forgetting it, that the arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I believe that's the quote. So you're right, it makes an impact if one decides to be attentive toward it.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Laura, followed by Joe. Laura, go ahead. Okay, Joe, go ahead.
I think she's just muted. That's all she was talking. But
okay.
So
okay.
Should I just go? I'll just go.
Go
you know, just building off of what Jeff's question was, the idea between, you know, how does this manifest itself? How would you define practical wisdom versus wisdom in the way you defined it earlier in the presentation? Because that was seemingly more of a theory of justice as well. Or, I mean, of wisdom. But how does that manifest itself in practicality in everyday life? And how would you define that?
I think, to me, that's why I've included the reference to the psychological typologies. And so if you look at the typologies that I claim find a balance in the concept of justice, they're all extroverted. And they're all, so extroverted sensation, extroverted thinking, extroverted feeling, and extroverted intuition. They're all taken in an extroverted sense, which means that they show in the world primarily. And the other thing that you'll notice, of course, is that I'm claiming that Athena takes the lead here. So in this consideration, what the best use and the best understanding of extroverted thinking will come forward and will most likely as not be your best guide in these situations. And then we could get into a very long discussion about how extroverted sensation, how the heck extroverted thinking correlates with the idea of what is justice or fairness, but really it boils down to, as they say, objectivity, but an objectivity in the sense of when you see that some circumstances are similar to others, and this good thing or this bad thing have happened in one instance, and something had to be done, some punishment had to be given, or some forgiveness had to be found. That's what the law does, is you look for common circumstances and precedents. And this has happened under this other situation 50 years ago, and the law was decided. And now this new situation has come up, and it looks an awful lot like the situation that was settled previously. So this is how we will consider it. so I think that that's how that works in that sense. Now, then when you slip into the other sense of, okay, then, well, you're saying prudence then, and you're saying that, oh my gosh, well, now prudence is all introverted. And so you've got introverted sensation and introverted intuition and introverted thinking and so on. Where does that come from? And here it gets to, this is a very subtle point. And because, of course, when Joseph Piper says, look to reality, reality will guide you. What the heck is reality? You know, it doesn't really answer the question. It sort of just presents another question. And so what I think is that if one, again, if one looks at that's why I find it useful, and that's why I propose considering these in relation to the psychological typologies, because then it's then you look at the qualities of the individual typologies, and one of the qualities of introverted intuition is taking the long view, is not necessarily being overwhelmed by the fashion of the moment, but taking the long view of things, where something came from, where it's going through in the most comprehensive possible manner. And then if you think of it in that regard, then that begins to give you some guidance. And so that's how I consider it.
Next up is Laura. Laura, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I keep thinking in terms of these being composite functions of one another. And I don't know, I just sort of see it that way. And so that you have these archetypical kinds of things. And within each one of those, there are certain levels, and with each one, several levels. And that, I don't know, I could see understanding things in that way. But there are multiple functions. I mean, for each type, there's a series of functions. Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely. And also, again, I'm considering these as manifestations of psychological archetypes. And the whole point of this is that they're so persistent, at least in Western culture, that if you look for them, you're really going to find them. And I tie them in that regard, I tie them in with Jung's conception, the psychological conception of individuation, which is a kind of a subtle motivation or subtle pressure over the course of your life to allow your behavior and your understandings of things to become greater and more all-encompassing and more all-inclusive and more patient and more hesitant about jumping at quick answers or quick solutions.
Oh, thank you very much, John. This was fantastic. So now we're going to go to breakout rooms where we get to discuss this idea in a small group, and then we'll come back, share our takeaways, we'll cross-pollinate between the various groups, and then we'll do one more round of breakout rooms. So that's the plan. So I'm going to start the breakout rooms